Thanks for having me at this conference. It's a privilege to be here. I suppose my topic is a little bit different from what has been presented prior. It's on the role of financial literacy when paying for residential aged care in Australia. I just want to recognise my co-authors, Anambil Grami, Megan Gu, Yuan Gu, and Mona Agdi. And also acknowledge the fact that this research was funded by an unconditional grant from the Extra Foundation, which used to be called the Financial Literacy Association. Okay, so as we know, around 60,000 people enter residential aged care each year. They can purchase, or not purchase, but they can pay for their accommodation through two primary ways. One is a refundable accommodation deposit. The other is a daily accommodation payment, but they can also pay with any combination of both. And just to give you an understanding what a refundable accommodation deposit is, if you're unaware, it is effectively a lump sum payment that's made to an aged care provider upon entry that's received once they leave that facility, whereas a daily accommodation payment is a rent style payment to a facility. Many people sell their home to pay for accommodation with assets left over. So for example, an average RAD value was 318,000. That's how much they pay to a facility in 2018-19, but the median house price was around 550,000. And that's median across Australia. If we think about, properties in the cities, that would be much higher, up to around about 1 million, or probably 1.2 million now, given that we've had a significant increase in property prices over the last 12 months. That means there are significant funds left over if someone sells their home and pays for a RAD. And people are asked to then make a decision around how they would reinvest that, additional funds, either in a low interest bearing but low risk deposit account, for example, or maybe developing an equity portfolio. Having said that, though, this decision comes at a super difficult time for individuals, residents who enter residential aged care. 63% of them are in some ways have some form of dementia. There is significant cognitive decline. And that means that most residents who enter residential aged care require significant help from informal carers, whether it be their son or their daughter, or even a partner that may be left in the family home who hasn't entered residential aged care. That means that choosing an accommodation payment is potentially the most complex financial decision a person will make in their lifetime, because they have to choose between a RAD or a DAP, but they also have to invest their funds elsewhere, and it's made at a time where cognitive decline is probably at its worst. Now, just to give you a background on what a RAD or a DAP or a combination of both is, here you have an individual on the left-hand side who typically enters a residential aged care facility either from hospital or from home. And typically, if it is from hospital, it's because of an adverse event that has led to an outcome and an assessment that that individual can't go back to their home. Once they start engaging with the residential aged care sector, they negotiate a price for a room. That price is then converted into a RAD. So if the room was 400,000, for example, that individual is required to pay 400,000. They've got 6 months to make that payment. But if they choose a DAP, daily accommodation payment, the RAD price is converted into a DAP using what's called a maximum permissible interest rate that's set by the federal government. And they have 28 days to choose between whether they want to pay for a RAD or a DAP. Of course, they can have any combination. For example, 1% RAD, 99% DAP, or vice versa. Once they exit a residential aged care facility, a RAD is then paid back into their estate. So effectively, a RAD is used by a facility for a number of reasons. One may be to generate income by them investing that RAD in some sort of portfolio of investments. But typically, RADs are used by providers to reduce their commercial debt. And we've seen there's a huge increase in RADs over the last 20 years when they were first introduced as accommodation bonds. and there's currently around about $31 billion worth of RADs that are sitting on provider balance sheets. And those RADs are actually guaranteed by the Australian government. So no individual will not receive their RAD back, even if the provider goes bankrupt. Now, the decision to choose between a RAD or a DAP is effectively an investment decision, because it means that that individual will have to reorganise their assets. So if we look down here, where we see on the bottom left-hand side where we see assets, we can split it up into three categories: a RAD, or a home, or other assets. And if a person chooses a RAD, they typically sell the family home, and then the remainder is invested into other assets. If they choose to pay a DAP, they may keep the family home and rent it out to extract rental income that can then be used to pay the DAP. Either way, the choice that an individual makes between a RAD or a DAP, or any combination, will impact a return, which is generated as an income. Similarly, any change in their assets will impact the assets and income test that's used to determine whether an individual receives government support through an aged pension, for example. Now, their total income, which is derived from their assets, but also government support, will be taxed. And after that, post-tax income means that an individual can then choose to either consume that income or to save that income. Now, if an individual chooses to consume, we can split that consumption up into four categories. Three of those are aged care related categories. Aged care services, which is part funded by the government, but also by the resident if that resident has means. Their aged care room. So not all individuals pay for their aged care room. If they have low means, they'll be deemed a supported resident, and the federal government will make a payment on their behalf. There's other services that an individual can pay for through aged care, which is basic daily services, you know, for example, laundry and meals, but also extra services. That isn't means tested. And then whatever is left over is for other consumption, grandchildren's presents, for example. Now, one of the issues we have, though, is that because that person is changing or deciding between a RAD or a DAP, they're also changing the assets and income test components that are determining their contributions to aged care services and how much they pay for their aged care room. And if you can imagine, it is a very complex decision to make, because if you choose a RAD, it will impact your assets and income test up here for your pension. It'll impact your income, which is then taxed, but it'll also impact your co-contributions to care. And so by just changing those that choice between a RAD or a DAP, it effectively changes all the components within this complex decision. So it means that an individual needs to have a fairly good understanding of what their choice will mean for their consumption, for their income, and even for their bequest value. Now, obviously, that's a difficult choice, and it is very difficult when you have some form of cognitive decline. So most people rely on informal carers. We surveyed 589 informal carers that were screened to ensure that they had a significant role in helping a resident enter into residential aged care and to make an accommodation payment decision. We looked at three sets of relationships. One, the relationship between informal carer characteristics and financial literacy. Another between financial literacy and using a financial advisor. And the third between financial literacy and a perceived decision complexity, decision certainty, and decision stress. We represented the financial literacy questions through what's called the Big Three set of questions. They ask relatively simple questions that tests an individual's understanding of interest, inflation, and risk. But we also ask people to self-report their financial literacy, because the literature suggests that self-reported financial literacy in some ways captures confidence around an individual's use of financial information, whether that confidence is founded or not is an area that we explore as well with a two-part measure. And that's a combination of both the big three questions and the self-reported financial literacy. Where does our literature fit? Well, we know that older people within Australia have poor financial literacy. We've seen that in a number of studies, but those studies have really focused on retirement planning. What hasn't really been explored is the way that this decision reflects a complex decision. And we know that people simplify complex decisions by ignoring complex information, by being myopic or using simplifying decision heuristics. We also know that acute stress can interfere with rational decision-making. And in this instance, someone moving into residential aged care is often under stress, both the informal carer and the resident, because if it is, for example, coming from a hospital situation, then they're most likely to not have thought about residential aged care, and they're forced to make some, excuse me, quite large and significant decisions in a relatively short period of time. So our study is the first to evaluate financial literacy in the context of aged care on these more emotive decision characteristics. And what it shows is it provides some indication of individuals making potentially suboptimal accommodation payment decisions, and that could lead to worse income, consumption, and wealth outcomes. These are the types of survey questions that we asked. We asked about the accommodation payment choice, the types of assistance they received in making that choice, how they paid for accommodation, feeling towards the payment process, the factors they considered in choosing the aged care home, but also the financial circumstances of the resident, the financial literacy of the respondent, which was the informal carer, plus their socio-demographics, and also the socio-demographics of the resident. Here is just some raw data on the financial literacy question itself, and it shows that only 48% answered the big three questions, all big three questions correctly. So 52% could be considered somewhat financially illiterate. And if we look at those who answered 0 questions correctly, or even just 1 question correctly, it would suggest that they're highly financially illiterate, because these questions are fairly simple in what they ask. We've got some more raw data as well around the self-rated ability to work with financial information. But more interestingly is this two-part financial literacy measure, which compares self-rated and the actual financial literacy. We know that we can see here that some people, 17%, perceived to have high financial literacy when in actual fact it was low. Similarly, 31% had perceived low financial literacy when in actual fact their financial literacy was high relative to the rest of the group. So there's some underconfidence in that group in their own financial ability. Here's a summary of the primary outcome variables. 67% were somewhat confident that their accommodation payment decision was best for the resident financially, which means 1/3 weren't confident in that decision. 84% understood the difference between what a RAD and a DAP was, but 60% found the whole process of paying for accommodation complex. And decision stress was represented by this question here, which suggests that 54% thought paying for accommodation was stressful for them. So I'll just go through some of these results, and I've highlighted them. This is the relationship, I've highlighted the significant results. This is the relationship between financial literacy and respondent characteristics. So we know that being a male is related to greater financial literacy, but we also see that there is a negative and slightly significant coefficient for English-speaking background, suggesting that those with an English-speaking background have less financial literacy. And even though that may seem counterintuitive, we seem to think that that may be due to some selection process whereby families who are of a non-English speaking background seek an individual within their family who are highly educated and who may have better English speaking skills. And therefore, because education is related to financial literacy, of which we do control for somewhat, but we think that that is still impacting this coefficient. We also see that those who are younger than 45 years have less financial literacy, and potentially those over the age of 45 to 64 have more financial literacy compared to 65 plus. That suggests a hump shape pattern in financial literacy, which is evident not only here, but in other financial literacy literature, both in Australia and internationally. Education is related to financial literacy. The less education you have, the less financially literate you are. And there's also a correlation, although it wasn't strong, between self-rated ability to work with financial information and an actual financial literacy, whereby those who self-rated themselves as poor or fair also had lower financial literacy as measured by the big three questions. Factors influencing the choice of seeking a financial advisor. So the resident characteristics didn't impact those, but we saw that moving from another residential aged care facility did, and we think that that's because if someone moves from one facility to another, they're taking an opportunity to explore all their options, including accommodation and the way that they are paid for their accommodation. In terms of informal carer characteristics, so there was little impact of the informal carer characteristics on choosing to seek a financial advisor, except for the fact that that individual thought that this decision was stressful. So the more stress that an informal carer experienced with the accommodation payment decision, the more likely they saw a financial advisor. Similarly, what we did see, though, is provider characteristics significantly influencing the choice to seek a financial advisor. So if they had suggested seeking a financial advisor, there was more likelihood that an individual would. And if they had informed the informal carer that there was 28-day decision-making period once the resident entered residential aged care to make a choice, then they were more likely to seek a financial advisor. And we think that's because people become aware that they have some time to make a decision rather than rushing into it. We also looked at the relationship between a financial advisor and the alternative financial literacy measures. We didn't see a relationship between self-rated financial literacy and financial advice, but we did see a relationship that was positive and significant between this two-part financial literacy measure, which looked at perceived low and actual high. So this suggests that those who do have an that responded well in the big three questions and had what we classified as high financial literacy, but thought that their financial literacy knowledge wasn't great, they were more likely to use a financial advisor. And we think that that's because people are underconfident with their abilities, but they do recognise that the situation and the choice that they're asked to make is an extremely complex one and therefore seek help. Now, this is the results on the factors that impact the decision confidence, complexity and stress. And we see here that financial literacy, measured by the big three questions, has little impact on these outcomes. It does positively impact the understanding between a RAD and a DAP, which we would expect, but it doesn't have any impact on decision confidence or decision stress. Again, though, we see that if the informal carer felt they had enough time, or the informal carer was informed about the 28-day decision-making period, there was positive impacts on decision confidence. So it increased, understanding increased, complexity was reduced, and decision stress was reduced as well. So giving someone the appropriate amount of time to make that decision seems to be beneficial. But again, we also saw that provider behaviour can impact the choice. And if a provider expressed the type of payment they want the consumer to pay, i.e. if they said, well, we'd like you to pay a RAD, then it reduced the decision confidence for the informal carer, and it also increased the decision complexity. We used a sensitivity analysis looking at the two alternative financial literacy measures across those three outcome measures. We looked at the individual questions within the big three, and again, there was limited impact on those on financial literacy on those 3 outcomes. We looked at perceived high financial literacy. Again, it was only around the understanding between lump sum and accommodation, lump sum and daily payments. But looking at this 2-part financial literacy measure, we do see there is somewhat of an impact in understanding the difference. So if you're perceived high, actual high, you have a much greater chance of understanding your differences between the lump sum and daily payments, and it would reduce your decision complexity. We also interacted higher financial literacy with having enough time to provide a behaviour, having enough time and provider behaviours on outcomes, and we saw that having enough time can increase the positive impacts on decision confidence if you do have financial literacy, and increase the understanding. And if you have high financial literacy and the provider did not express a preference payment, your confidence increases significantly, and so does your understanding. So in terms of a discussion, we found that financial literacy is poor among many informal carers. And that is, in an environment where informal carers are expected to help a resident with significant decline, make a very complex decision, which we saw within that schematic that I presented earlier. We know that higher financial literacy is associated with being male, middle-aged, and education. But financial advisor use was only related with perceived low and actual high financial literacy, suggesting that confidence in one's ability to understand financial information and recognising complexity is an important driver for seeking financial advice. There was no relationship with the big 3 questions or self-rated financial literacy on their own with using financial advice. And that sort of shows now that using this combined metric, which is perceived and actual financial literacy, can provide some further insights into financial advisor use. We saw that financial literacy had some relationship with reduced decision complexity, but little relationship with confidence or stress. We conclude that financial literacy education is unlikely to substantially reduce suboptimal accommodation payment decisions, because we think that complexity means that decision heuristics and biases will still remain, even if someone has financial literacy education, because we didn't see that strong relationship between financial literacy and those outcomes. We suggest that financial education, rather than financial education being provided, there should be greater focus on financial advice, because it can account for individual financial and personal circumstance. Having said that, financial advice and its use is not guaranteed. The literature suggests there's a lack of trust with financial advisors. People become anxious that they're unable to understand advice. There's overconfidence, as we've seen in this study, that people understand what they're choosing when in actual fact they don't. And there's even a lack of interest in using financial advice, even if it could benefit them. And we see that in the superannuation sector, because there are a whole bunch of people who are in underperforming funds and paying too much on their fees. Our conclusion is that the Australian government should consider simplifying the accommodation payment decision by, for example, removing means testing to reduce that complexity, or even indeed removing RADs altogether and relying on DAPs. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. That was an excellent, informative talk, not only for researchers, but also for our audience, which includes members from the public and obviously the researchers and the clinicians. So thank you again for accepting to talk at this conference. I have a quick question from Viviana, that given the cost of houses, is it that people are less likely to own their homes in the future, such that more people in need of care won't have any assets to sell or rent out?
Sorry, say that again. I just missed the first bit.
Given the cost of the house, do you think that people are less likely to, own their homes?
Yes, that's a good question. I suppose there's a difference between buying a house or buying a residence that's either a house or an apartment. And, even though someone can't buy a house, they may take what they consider the second best option is, which is buying an apartment. There's no suggestion that the preferences for owning your own place are significantly changing. So I would suggest that there are still opportunities to extract wealth out of your asset. But what we don't have at the moment really is a financial instrument that is good enough to help individuals do that. So people are forced to sell their family home. And there are calls out there for a financial product that is palatable to older people, that allows them to access the wealth in their home without actually having to sell their home, which means that they could, for example, use their home and participate in their price increases while extracting some equity. We also have, obviously, superannuation balances increasing. So there is an opportunity to use some of the funding within those superannuation balances to pay for RAD. But again, it's sort of it's counterintuitive to what our superannuation system is supposed to be, which is really using that superannuation balance down towards the end, basically not having anything left over by the time you die. I mean, that was really the original intent of it. But, as we've seen, many people aren't doing that, and they are just bequesting quite a significant proportion of their super balance to their children.
Thank you so much. I think the conclusion that you mentioned, getting the right, trustworthy financial advice is so important. I think earlier on would be certainly helpful in the decision-making tasks of this complex model. Thank you again.